We're in session number 7, which means we're on the downhill side of our event. But and this session is on school choice, and we have. I'm going to kick off and then pass on the baton to the other 3 gentlemen. And but a little bit of a background on this. Interestingly enough, the first term paper I ever wrote in high school was on the Canadian system of funding religious schools. So this has been a bee in my bonnet since I'm about 13 years old. And then when I went to Fordham to get my doctorate in education, the second year we were asked to pick topics for a dissertation. And I said I wanted to do something on the Supreme Court in Catholic schools. And the very anti-Catholic Fordham said, well, that's a very introspective, introverted approach. You ought to broaden your horizons a little. And I said, well, I don't think it's a question of introspective or introverted. If we don't have some kind of aid, we're not going to have any schools to be extroverted about. And so we thought about it for a while. And then finally, they said, well, you don't have expertise in constitutional law. And I said, well, we've been told in about 90 credits of education that sometimes one of the fewer ways of gaining expertise is through coursework. I said, this has been a lifetime study. And at the time, I was the PR man for the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights. We were dealing with these issues every day. And so they said, well, I said, could I prove competence in any way? Well, how would you propose to do that? And I said, I would like to write the first chapter and send it to experts in the field who can give an objective evaluation to you, the committee. All right. So I sent it to Bill Ball, who was the great constitutional lawyer based in Harrisburg, Monsignor John Tracy Ellis, who was the Dean of American Church Historians at Catholic U, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of New Jersey, Justice Hughes, who happened to be a graduate of the school that I was the administrator of. And at any rate, they all read the chapter and they said it was spot on, and therefore the project should go ahead. And then the folks at Fordham said, well, all right, you've proved your competence, but our problem is we are not competent to evaluate this dissertation. And I said, well, that may be true. I said, but the last time I checked, about 300 yards from this building is the law school of Fordham. And well, nobody there would be interested. I said, well, actually, I have found someone who's interested, Father Charles Whalen, who is a constitutional lawyer. Oh. And so the bottom line is I was able to do it. And what I have here is a Reader's Digest version of that dissertation. And the chapters that are here deal with the so-called public policy question of any form of government aid, and particularly the constitutional question. Now, some opening observations before passing on the baton. The stopper in the conversation for decades has been it's constitutionally prohibited to have any kind of government aid flowing to religious schools. And so I think the first point to make is, and I want to underscore this very strongly, I don't want a penny of government money going into a Catholic school. Our issue is aid to parents, and parents then choose where they want the money to go. We'll come back to that point in a moment. However, and there is a point to this, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And so this is one of the huge problems in the Canadian system of funding. The money goes directly to the school, and there is hardly any Catholic identity left to the Catholic schools in Canada. They're now forced to have LGBT clubs. You can't speak about abortion negatively because this is going to traumatize students and teachers who have had abortions and so forth. So the whole purpose of Catholic education was completely undermined because they've been eating at the public trough for over 100 years. Secondly, it's easier to pursue this issue today for the simple reason that in the past, and until about 30 years ago, when we talked about government aid to religiously oriented schools, or as the opponents like to call us, sectarian schools, which makes it sound very bad and nasty, that it was 90% Catholic schools. And unfortunately, our percentage of the market share is considerably down, while other denominations, particularly evangelicals, are up. And so it's much easier to talk about this in a less hostile environment. The anti-Catholicism is still very real, but they can't say it's the Catholic Church that's reaping the primary benefits. And along with that, with the advent of other denominational schools coming into the mix, it's amazing that up through about 1965-70, the Southern Baptist Convention was absolutely convinced that one penny flowing to a sectarian school was a horrible violation of Jefferson's wall of separation of church and state. With their getting involved into the school system, they now have a different view of the Constitution. They no longer see a great problem with any kind of aid. Also, of course, they weren't in the school business because, particularly in the South, they had control of the state schools. And as they have lost that control, they've now had to move into the school business to be in survival mode. When I worked for the Catholic League, it was in the heyday of the Reagan years. And of course, all kinds of school choice things were being talked about on a regular basis. And I took my dog and pony show on the road up and down the Eastern Seaboard for 5 years, talking to Catholic school parent groups. And I had a very well-refined presentation and about the constitutional issues, about how to form public policy, all the rest of it. And then I'd open up for questions, and invariably, the first question or first comment was, but Father, we have the opportunity to use the public schools. We've chosen not to do that. That's our choice. So I guess we have to pay for our choice. I said, Father Bloom, Virgil Bloom, constitutional lawyer, wrote a book in the 50s called Catholics, Political Pygmies. And I said, what you are saying could have been said by a black in 1850. I'm black. My parents are black. They were slaves. Their parents were slaves. To be black is to be a slave. Be comfortable with your identity. And it was a shocking idea to them. When I was a kid in grammar school here in Newark, my mother, who was an activist long before it was fashionable, and at the time I told you, in New Jersey in the 50s and early 60s, 1 out of every 2 children in school was in a Catholic school in the state. And my mother said to the pastor, probably about 1959, Monsignor, I think what we ought to do is close down the Catholic schools for a week and throw them all into the public schools and see what happens. And he said, oh, Mrs. Stravinskas, we'd never want to do that. People would think we're not good citizens. All right? Now, of course, we don't have to worry about 1 out of every 2 every 2 kids being in Catholic school. It's less than 1 in 20. But it's precisely that kind of an attitude. In those little journeys that I made to schools, at one point, I was invited to a Catholic school in Philadelphia that was about 95% black and about 60% non-Catholic. And they invited me in the middle of August. Needless to say, the school auditorium had no air conditioning. It had a fan, but if you put the fan on, you couldn't hear the speaker. And it was about 105 degrees. And I was supposed to start at 7:30. And when we started, when 7:30 came, there were 2 parents in the auditorium. And the nun said, oh, they'll come, don't worry. And in about 20 minutes, we had about 300 parents. incredible turnout. I gave my standard spiel about how to, what you need to know and how do you need to proceed. And I said, now one more point. I said, most of you are not Catholic, but you know that we Catholics consider ourselves to be a family. And you're a part of our family to the extent that you have committed your children to our care for these 9 years. And I said, so I'd like to speak to you as a member of the family. I said, it's very good that I'm explaining to you how to lobby Congress and your state legislature and so forth. I said, but before you do any of lobbying whitey, it would be a good idea to lobby your black leaders. I said, because Jesse Jackson is opposed to tuition tax credits, he's opposed to vouchers, but his kids go to Catholic school in Chicago. Jesse Jackson can afford to pay for the tuition, but he doesn't care that you can't. And I said, and I can go through a whole laundry list of black leaders who are adamantly opposed to any kind of government aid. I said, so I just wanted to make that point. Any questions? Silence. Dead silence. And the pastor and the principal looked at me like, oh, geez, what have you done? And from the back of the hall, a little old black lady, she said, Father, I'd like to say something. So I said, yeah. And she said, I want to come up. I said, oh, Lord. She comes up and she said, you don't like what the Father said. I don't like it either. The problem isn't whether or not we like it, whether or not it be true. And you and I all know it's true. And so we have to admit that there's a problem and we have to do something about it. And so I want to hear an amen to what the Father just said about blacks lobbying blacks. I said, I can't hear you. Amen. She said, that's a white amen. I want a big black amen. And she got the big black amen. She said, I think there are going to be questions now, Father. And we were there till 1 o'clock in the morning. Right? She had broken the ice. But I think this is part of the thing. We have to break through some of these preconceived notions. And also now, again, because of other groups being involved, an ecumenical and interfaith coalition. I was at a meeting at the Chancery in Metuchen Diocese 2 weeks ago that they hosted a meeting of a New Jersey Coalition for School Choice. And we had Orthodox Jews, evangelicals, Muslims, ourselves. And you know, it shows that there's a broad consensus for this. And then, as I made the point, you know, never direct aid. So my thing is always vouchers or whatever you want to call them. And people say, well, isn't that going to lead to control eventually also? No more than food stamps do, all right? If someone is entitled to food stamps, he can go to ShopRite, Acme, A&P, whatever else he wants to go to. The government doesn't tell the store how to run its business. You simply cash in your food stamps. And that's the way it needs to work with the whole school thing. In the states that have gone for vouchers in varying degrees, Indiana, Florida, the city of Milwaukee, have all had rather grand success with all of this, huh? And Monsignor, what is it about, what's the increase in Catholic school attendance in the States since you've got the vouchers?
Oh, probably about 30%.
Yeah, I thought 30 or 40%, yeah. And same thing in Florida. And with no problems whatsoever. No problems in terms of how this has been negotiated and involvement with the schools. Now, I do think it's important to engage the constitutional argument, but you need one person who knows about it, but you need everybody else to be involved in the lobbying process. So letters to the editor, spots on radio and television and so forth to get the conversation going. And with the latest Supreme Court decision a couple of weeks ago, the whole Blaine Amendment thing, I think, is essentially thrown out the window. The Blaine Amendments, as you may know, started with anti-Catholicism trying to ensure that there could be no kind of government aid to any Catholic school. They didn't say Catholic, but we were the ones that were in the business in the 19th century. And that, what is it, 35 states, I guess, still have Blaine amendments of various kinds. But with the Supreme Court decision a couple of weeks ago, it looks like that's.
We hope.
Yeah.
It's not totally clear, but.
Well,
it's not clear that it would lead to schools, to states that have schools, but it's.
Well, it seems that already some of the states have said, we better get rid of it.
Especially the ones with the weak Blaine amendments.
Yeah.
There's kind of like 3 levels of severity.
Yeah.
So the harder ones would be a different story. Tommy,
Good.
I understand that some of the concurring justices wrote a separate concurring opinion trying to limit it. So basically,
Yes.
We're talking about playgrounds here, not classrooms. Whereas some of the other justices said, this is broader.
Yeah.
And so we'll find out.
So I would encourage you to invest the $5. It's a special deal. As we say in New York, what a deal. And take one, read it yourself, give it to other interested lay people. And here is the reverse of what I'm going to say, what I said earlier about how putting the collar out front is good to get money from donors. In this instance, stay away from it. It's have parents do this, okay? We don't have kids. They do. And don't want it to appear like clerical manipulation of the thing and then resurrect the whole anti-Catholicism again.
We're running a little late, aren't we?
Just talk.
Well, but not for too long.
That's right.
I got seriously interested in school choice around 1998 or 91 when I saw another announcement, the Cardinal announcing another round of school closings in the New York Diocese. I happen to be in the Rockville Center Diocese on Long Island. I just looked at it from a business point of view. How does it make sense to close an operation that's low cost and has happy customers and force those customers into a higher cost environment? And I guess this is what really got me ticked off, and push up my property taxes. At the same time, I was elected to the public school board where my 2 children attended. I ran for the board because I thought the public schools cost too much and I might be able to do a little bit of something about that. And I thought that the public schools were not following the law so far as children with disabilities were concerned, including my son Matthew, who had serious difficulties from birth. We all know that there are 3 reasons for school choice: the moral question, the educational question, and some of us, I guess, are aware of the cost saving. To us, of course, the moral question is the most important. But perhaps that's not going to be the way we can sell the concept to many others. So I and some of my friends have been trying to emphasize the great savings, particularly in New York, because that's where I am, because the cost differential between the parochial schools and the public schools is tremendous, because New York's public school costs are so high, something like $21,000, maybe even higher now, $21,000 per student. Even the UN Declaration on Human Rights says parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education to be given to their children, from the Declaration of Human Rights back in.
At no cost, it says. Absolutely. And so our policy of funding is in violation even of the UN Declaration of Human Rights.
And certainly what's done in many other countries, dozens of other countries, have ways to support parochial education. And of course, in the United States, some states, you mentioned particularly Indiana and Florida, are moving in that direction. The problem is that you're talking about a few 100,000 kids are benefiting from this when we really need millions to benefit. you've already mentioned the hole, I call it here, that was punched in the Blaine Amendment of Missouri with the recent decision. So that gives us tremendous hope for the future. With Trump's advocacy for school choice, though, if he does something at the federal level, we don't have to worry about the Blaine amendments because those are in state constitutions. And I believe that the simplest thing to do would be to simply bring down to the secondary and elementary level the college level credits that now exist. There is the American Opportunity Credit, and there's another credit, one you take on page 1 of your return and the other one on page 2, depending upon what the family's income or your other expenses are. But the bottom line is anybody who's got a kid in college can get a $2,500 tax credit. And I think in some circumstances, this is even refundable. Now, that's not a lot, but if that were brought down to the elementary level, that would cover half the tuition at most of the parochial schools in the United States. It should be more, and we could work to make it more, but that would really be simple. I think we should be writing to Congress and Trump and his staffers, whoever's working on this for him, and advocate for that because it's really simple. The tax savings in New York for the tax credit scholarship bill amount to billions. You shift a couple of 100,000 kids and out of the public schools at $20,000 a pop. It's an incredible saving. The question is that how to get it done. And I think it was said earlier that perhaps we Catholics haven't been working enough. It was mentioned that there are non-Catholic supporters of Catholic schools, but the fact of the matter is, this is a Catholic issue, primarily, in New York anyway. You don't have the evangelicals in Texas, in New York. So my friends and I came up with the idea, how can you get pressure on the assembly legally? Because we have to work within the bounds of the Johnson Amendment. Maybe we should talk about that. Has everybody heard of the Johnson Amendment? But we don't know what it amended, and it doesn't matter what it amended. But basically, it sets the rules for what, not religious organizations, but any non-profit organization that is a 501c3. And of course, we all know not all nonprofits are 501c3s. But the difference is 501c3s, when I give them a donation, it becomes tax deductible to me. And the rules say, if you have an organization like that, you can't support a particular political party or a particular candidate. But within bounds, you can advocate for issues and even specific legislation. It just can't be more than a substantial part of your operation. Court cases have set a range of somewhere between 5 and 15%. We need to get that clarified because it's kind of a slippery slope. If an organization, if a not-for-profit, and I'm specifically thinking of the Knights of Columbus, because my friends and I had this idea of getting petitions with 1 million signatures. Where's the people power to carry these petitions? And we said, gee, the Knights of Columbus, this would sound like a natural for them to support the Catholic schools. They don't want to do it because they're afraid they'll lose their tax-exempt status. And one of the wrinkles in this is, if you do a campaign, you have to value the time of volunteers. But there's no guidelines for how you should do that. Do you use the minimum wage? Is a retired electrician worth more than a retired professor or a housewife? Or So it's you just don't know until somebody sues you and the IRS sues you, and you wind up in court. You just imagine what the people that we read about last year in the IRS, what they would do in a situation like that. So I'm kind of frustrated. I think Catholics should be doing more. 25 years ago, I went to the school board of my local parish to talk about school choice and try to get them to be more active in the campaign. Because even back then, we actually had bills in the legislature. And they listened politely, and then the principal said, "Thank you very much. When the bishop asks us, we will act. In the meantime, we don't do anything." So last year, Bishop Murphy, who just retired, wrote an article in the Long Island Catholic called "Believe and Profess." There's a copy of it in that stack for you. I read it as marching orders. So I went back to Our Lady of Peace School Board and asked for another audience armed with this, and also armed with the article from the New York Post where Cardinal Dolan is advocating for the tax credit bill. This time they simply refused to meet with me. So I sit there, I say to myself, if people who run our Catholic schools aren't willing to stand up, aren't willing to go badger their elected officials, how can we expect them to do anything? The teachers union's got a guy in Albany, one in the Assembly and one in the Senate. I think they got it covered 24 hours a day. And they're constantly twisting arms and making contributions and pointing out that they've got a monthly newsletter and their people come out and vote and they're married and they got kids that vote and so on and so forth. So if we're going to get something done, the only way to counter that basically is to go to your elected officials and show you have more votes than the teachers union. I mean, to me, it's that simple.
Interesting, you talk about tax issues. Someone just wrote an article for our Catholic Education Journal who said there's something that ought to be considered. We all know there's a often great differential between what a teacher gets in the Catholic school and what he or she would get in the local government school. Sometimes the difference of $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 a year. And this man has proposed an amendment to the tax code that would allow that teacher to take a credit on his income tax as a charitable donation. You can't do it now, but what's the purpose of that? That would help pay back to the teacher some of the differential in terms of what he would be paying on his taxes. And so, and that, what would that help? That would help with teacher maintenance rather than having the teacher go off to the public school after 5 years, may be willing to stay with us for the prolonged period, for the longer haul.
That's an interesting approach. And to me, anything that we can actually get implemented that helps the Catholic schools, I'll take it.
Well, and see, this is part of the argument too, and this is where the teachers' unions are so powerful. They don't want $1 to go because they know correctly it's the camel's nose in the tent.
Exactly.
How did Governor Christie become so unpopular in New Jersey? Had nothing to do with Bridgegate. It had to do with his first month in office when he declared war on the public school teachers union, right? He pulled back on all their pensions and said, this is out of control. And he became public enemy number one. And so he could go give a talk on the Jersey Shore about safe water, and there would be a shill in the audience from the public school teachers lobby to turn the whole thing into a debacle about how come you hate public schools and you send your children to elite private schools. No, he sends his children to the parish school in the Patterson diocese, all right? That's not very elite. Now his boys have gone to Del Barton Prep, which is the Benedictine prep school. But This is the problem with the teachers union. And in New York City, I remember 30 years ago, when the Catholic school teachers union, which to me is a complete oxymoron, wanted to hook up with the public school teachers union of the state of New York. This is our enemy, and our Catholic school teachers say, we want to get into bed with them. So, I mean, it's all nuts. Tom, you want to pick up?
On that specific point?
Or any, now just go.
So I only have a few more minutes to stay, but I was going to defer all my time with Tom anyway, so.
Oh, wow, okay.
Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so what Anthony asked me to talk about is we have a moment in time right now, which is really an extraordinary one politically, in which you have both houses, and I'll explain why this isn't a purely partisan point, but it partly is. Both houses of Congress are Republican, and the president is at least nominally Republican, and however you would describe the president. But the important thing for the issue that we've been talking about is both the House Republicans and the Senate Republicans and the president really do not care what the teachers unions think on this issue. There's never been a case where you've had that alignment. And you have a president that, whatever anybody may think of him on a whole array of issues, he is totally unaffected in a way that no other president has been by special interests. You can't buy a guy who's worth $10 billion. And he spends not a millisecond thinking what the teachers unions think about educational issues. Now, that's got them all exercised and so forth. They also made a political judgment, which is different than they do at the state level, that 95% or more of their political money would go to the Democrats. In New York, they give money to both sides under the insight that you could buy a Republican for about 5 cents more than a Democrat, which has proven itself to be true in New York. But at the federal level, they've gone all in on one side. The problem with that is, as people have watched for the last 30 years, the presidency keeps flip-flopping from one party to the other. And so when the Republicans are in charge, they're essentially kind of frozen out. But they're frozen out more now than they've ever been in my lifetime. So that's the opportunity. And I've been spending a lot of time down in Anthony's, Washington, D.C., and I have not met a single Republican congressman or U.S. senator, anybody in the White House that is cowed by the teachers unions. They're just not. So what that gives us for the first time is freedom of conversation, talk about lots of things. What they're converging on is the idea of an issue that we've been working on for 5 years in New York, which is a tax credit to donors to encourage charitable donations to K-12 scholarship funds. And there are lots of different ways, as we've talked about, that you can do school choice, and I'm in favor of almost all of them. But this is the one that everybody seems to be crystallizing around. There are a couple issues that have come up already that we've been heavily engaged in. One is, ironically, the American Federation for Children, which Betsy DeVos used to chair. And Betsy DeVos is a very devout person, evangelical, not Catholic, but comes from a deeply religious family, as does her husband. And but her former organization has argued for only allowing scholarships to be handed out by secular organizations. So we, the group that I represent, the Invest in Education Coalition, which is mostly funded by donors to the Archdiocese Intercity Scholarship Program and a variety of other scholarship programs, and some prominent Jewish donors who are either conservative Jews or Orthodox Jews. There are also some large Protestant donors as well. So that's kind of the mix of people that are involved. So all of them were offended, as I was personally, and as was the Cardinal. And so we've spent the last couple of months pulling together a coalition that, as of last night, was 117 organizations across the state, including across the country, excuse me. The U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, the National Catholic Education Association, Agudath Israel, which represents the Orthodox Jews, the Christian Coalition, the Faith and Freedom Coalition, which some of you know Ralph Reed chairs, Focus on the Family chapter in Indiana, and these 2 school organizations that represent all the evangelical schools in the country. As a result of that, or part of that, there's no there's virtually no support in the Congress for keeping out religious scholarship organizations. And the White House has stated privately but definitively to the people that are in favor of that approach that they just are not. That's not where the White House has no interest in doing that whatsoever. The second big issue, so I think on that issue we've prevailed. The fight's not over, but the trajectory is pretty clear on that one. The second one is some people in the administration have argued, outside of the White House, other people have argued that this should be viewed as kind of a states' rights issue. And because some conservatives are opposed to any federal role in education whatsoever, and some conservatives in Congress are opposed to the education reform even existing for a whole variety of reasons. And a bunch of Obama guidance letters at the end of his tenure kind of crystallized that issue for a lot of people. But their view is that if we do a scholarship tax credit, it should be, each state should have to opt into the tax credit. Now, the problem with that concept is they're assuming it's a government program that they're being opted into. This is not a government program. It's simply allowing private citizens to make charitable donations. And the government is, in a sense, backing off on the taxation a little, much in the way that it does with the charitable deduction. So from my view, it's exactly scholarship. If you donate to a scholarship group now, you get a charitable deduction. We're just talking about changing the number from 35 cents on a dollar to $1 on a dollar. Not that that's trivial, but that's literally, you're just changing a number. Literally nothing else needs to be changed. There doesn't need to be any federal regulation. There doesn't need to be any infringements on religious liberty. We don't have to go into an array of, fashionable social issues. We don't have to have all kinds of federal or state regulatory apparatus set up because all these scholarship funds already exist. There's tens of thousands of them in the country. And the check on them from going crazy is the IRS can revoke the C3 status if somebody does something exotic, like engage in terrorist activities or something. If you have a Muslim school that goes too far, what have you, for example. Fraud is the more common circumstance. And every state has a charities bureau that can explore fraud, and state attorney generals and the U.S. Attorney General have the ability to go after bad actors. So this notion that you have to have all this extra regulation because some people view it as public money, but it's actually not public money. So the Supreme Court, in a case on the Arizona scholarship tax credit, said essentially that there could not be any possible establishment clause case and denied standing for the case because there was no public money involved whatsoever. It was a private individual giving a private donation to a private nonprofit who was in turn awarding it to a private child from a private family and who was going to redeem it at a private school. So there's nothing in that arc that has anything to do with government money. And the only way you could consider that donation government money is if you believe that all money that anybody earns is the government money, unless they're nice enough to give it back to you. And so that's kind of the intellectual construct behind like the whole concept of tax expenditures. So at any rate, so I think that's that issue. The second issue is in the interest of time. I mean, those are the major issues that are being debated. And so my own prediction is that it will end up applying to all 50 states, like every other element of the federal tax code. And this idea of an opt-in, which in some circles in DC currently has currency, I think as people start thinking that through, it's going to wither up and die. From a political perspective, what it means is any state that is partially or totally controlled by the Democrats politically would obviously not opt in. If you have two houses, your legislature and government, you only need one of them to say no, to stop and opt in. And that literally works out to 25 states fit that characteristic. And among the 25 states that would be knocked out are Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, et cetera, all of which are states that the president has a great interest in handing out scholarships in for a variety of obvious electoral reasons. So the idea that he would come up with a plan that, keeps them limited to a certain set of states and has them nothing to talk about in the rest of the country, my hunch is he doesn't go there. That was the second thing of it. There's a bill, and there's some skirmishes that we think that we've won so far. Is we built out this coalition that now has a diverse coalition from around the country. And the next piece we're layering in, which we already did in New York, is labor unions. Now, when people hear these issues, the teacher union tries to give the impression that all of the entire labor movement union is with them. But they're actually not, because their interests aren't aligned. If you look at the schools in any major urban area and you start looking through the occupations of the parents, it's cops, firefighters, construction workers, nurses, sanitation engineers, and all the rest. So what we found at end, if you look at those unions, whether it's Philly or Chicago or Boston or New York, for example, or Pittsburgh, the union leadership are primarily, for historic reasons, depending on which occupation you're talking, it's mostly Irish and Italian or other Catholic ethnicities, and more recently Hispanics, who are gaining a foothold in a lot of those occupations, and are the kind of the big growth, particularly in New York. That's where virtually all the immigration growth is coming, is on the Hispanic side. So if you look at those unions, they're essentially Catholic unions. And so Cardinal Dolan worked with us in New York and had people in. He did a special mass for them. He took pictures with their wives and their kids, and he was calling labor leaders one by one and doing public events with him. And between our work behind the scene and the Cardinals' kind of, one-on-one charm or advocacy, whatever you want to call it, we were able to get more than 30 labor unions in the state to break with the teachers union and come out in favor of a scholarship tax credit. And so in Chicago, in Everett, in Illinois, they now have 55 labor unions that have broken with the teachers union. So this has...
Sorry, I've got to go. Make sure to say what priests should be.
Yes, I'm leading up to
All
it.
right.
So then the next question is, we have this big coalition. It's diverse ethnically, it's diverse by matter of faith, it's diverse in terms of union composition, which is very unusual. The question is, what's the role of the Catholic Church in this overall coalition? Because not every member is created equal. And the Catholic Church has assets that virtually no other religion has, or doesn't have them to the same degree. And particularly in a lot of key swing states, it has tremendous assets. Not because they're swing states, but just historically where the Catholic Church, from an immigrant reason, has established beachheads. So just like if you look at New York City, who is at the forefront of almost all the immigration issues and immigration intake and counseling and everything else in New York City, the Catholic Church has a bigger footprint than anybody else. They run nursing homes. We obviously, whatever you may think of, particularly universities like Fordham, but the Catholics run major universities and hospitals, even still. And so the Catholic Church has, in a state like New York, the advantage the teachers unions have versus any other organization is there are teachers in every single Senate district and Assembly district. And in New York, there's 10,000 school buildings. There's a union leader for each of those 10,000. What it would take from a grassroots perspective to create an organization that had 10,000 leaders, it would take thousands of years to build. So it'd be impossible to do. But the Catholic Church is in every single Assembly district, every single Senate district. And even though there are less schools than there used to be, if you combine all the different tentacles of Catholic charities, all the universities, the healthcare stuff, and everything else all together, the Catholic Church is a major employer. And it's also, from a legislative perspective in New York, 40% of the legislature are Catholic, and more than are Catholic. A lot of them went to Catholic schools. For better or for worse, the governor's Catholic or nominally Catholic. But
Didn't go to Catholic school, thank God.
No, he actually did.
Right?
Yeah, in Queens. But anyway, my point being, it's not only you have this geographic footprint, but you have relationships. So I joke, not suggesting that anybody should, violate the vow of secrecy in a confessional booth, but the nature of a relationship of a priest or somebody who's taking care of somebody in a Catholic nursing or a Catholic hospital, and a legislator or a legislative staff person or their mother or their grandmother is different than it is between a secular teacher union and that person. And the religion which some people, we're supposed to hide that we're all Catholic, like that's something icky, or we got cooties, or whatever the right phrase is. But that unique character, that relationship, is what actually gives the church, if it would wake up and realize it, much greater power than the teachers union, because there's this emotional religious connection that you will never have with the secular institution. And so when I was joking about a confession, if somebody hears a legislator's confession on Thursday, I'm pretty sure on Monday he'll take your phone call. Okay, so we've had instances where we have a labor union leader in one assembly district, is a Knights of Columbus member, first labor union guy to endorse a Democrat. That we had 5 or 6 lobbyists talk to the person, people in the district, business people, everything else. And then when we found out the labor union leader was a Knights of Columbus member, and I joke that Cardinal Dolan's given me kind of a blanket forgiveness for everything I do in the course of trying to get the bill through. So we told the guy that Cardinal Dolan, which was not true, we told him that Cardinal Dolan wanted him to call the guy. I would really appreciate it. Cardinal Dolan didn't know the guy, but anyway, so he then calls the assemblyman, and because we hear Knights of Columbus member, he hears labor union leader, and sure enough, within 5 minutes, the guy bucked the teachers union and went on the bill. We had a guy who runs in a district in Newburgh, runs a Catholic school, which is kind of the go-to school for the Hispanic community in Newburgh. And we could not get this assemblyman on the bill. He's a Democrat, a long-term serving Democrat. And then the priest who was in charge of that school called him up, and he didn't want anyone saying anything bad to the Hispanic community around that school. He went on the bill like that same day, he went on the bill. So there are a number, I won't get into all the circumstances, but there are a number of cases like that where people don't realize the power of relationships that they have. And you know, I was in a hospital at the state center I used to work for, and the nun who was in charge of the hospital, he was in there for a hip replacement. She was in there lobbying him on healthcare issues because she had him. He was stuck there for 3 days. But that was a person who understood that she had a moment and she had an opportunity and she used it. And I just think there are countless opportunities for people if they really thought through who they knew and what their relationships with people. It could be, you know, their neighbor. It could be, you know, there's an affiliation with a Catholic institution and a Boy Scouts, and they have a kid or a grandkid in a Boy Scout troop. There's like a million different, you know, interrelationships that could be. If we ever figured out all the social, political, economic capital of the Catholic Church and actually mobilized it, okay? But it then requires, you know, the question that comes, why do you care about all of this stuff and why would you go through all this? And this is what I think people don't focus on. With the schools, we basically have a hospice mentality. They're dying. We're just going to try to make the death as painless as possible. And people have been worn down over the years. They're tired of fundraising, and they've seen other schools close, and it's just the way it's always been. It's the way it's always going to be. There was a time, going back into the 1800s, if an Irishman or an Italian showed up, or a Polish person, whatever it was, the Catholic Church would do anything at any expense to make sure that every single child had a Catholic school to go to.
We talked about that last night.
And if you were Irish, you went to St. Patrick's, you were Italian, you went to St. Anthony's, and everybody went. And now you look at all the Hispanic immigration into New York City, particularly in the Bronx. Like 3% of Hispanics in the Bronx are in a Catholic school. There's no sense of urgency among anybody, but it's the first immigrant group that we basically have shafted.
That's right.
I mean, not to be overly direct, but that's the truth. So somebody needs to, you know, and then if you look at the future of the Catholic Church, and everybody talks about the shortage of priests and the shortage of quality bishops and cardinals, and I jokingly refer to the Catholic Church as a pyramid scheme. And by what I mean by that, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but it all starts, the pyramid goes up to the Pope at the top. But at the bottom, it starts with kids going to Catholic schools. And if you have no kids going to Catholic schools, you're going to have less kids in church. And you have less people in church, you have less people choosing to become priests and nuns. And then when that shrinks, the pool from which you're going to get inspired bishops or cardinals is going to shrink dramatically. And then you end up with what you end up with. So the bottom shrinks, and then everything shrinks all the way up. So if, you know, I would say if you believe, I know everybody believes, but if people thought of it rather than like, oh, you know, I run Catholic charities, I raise money for this, I raise money for that, and oh, you know, my CFO tells me we've got to close a couple schools this year. If that's kind of your managing decline, then you would never go through all the effort to figure out how you can take all the political, social, economic capital of the church and, you know, in a sense, storm the Bastille. So because you just let it go by. But if you realize that what's at stake here is all the children that you're losing, And you're actually losing the entire future of the Catholic Church because people aren't willing to get off their butts and give it the fight of their lives. Then you're going to get what you deserve in a sense. And so I think people should take what's going on much more seriously, and they should figure out how to get this. And I understand everybody's got lots of things to do, but if you actually believe the future of the faith is contingent on getting kids in Catholic schools, then everything else you're doing or anybody else is doing is actually not as important because there'll be nothing to do. You'll spend all your time driving around in parishes that are, 150 miles wide because there'll be nobody to serve anymore. And so I think this is, this isn't the case with all the faiths that are involved in this fight, but the Catholic Church is uniquely a target from a cultural perspective because the left, if you saw the coverage on the Podesta emails, in which you have high-level Democratic operatives talking about how they can remake the Catholic Church in the image of a political party, which is like a shockingly disgusting thing for either party to attempt to do. So we have a huge target on our back, but that doesn't mean we all need to walk around sheepishly and worry about what they think about all of us. We have the right to assert the right of all of these children to get a faith-based education. And simple as that. I don't think anybody should apologize for it. And I think everything we do should be organized around, to me, that's the #1 goal. And we've talked, and while we're saving Catholic schools, we have to make sure that they're actually Catholic schools. So the Catholicity of a lot of the Catholic schools. We had a Bishop Hubbard for a while up in Albany. So we had the 40-year reign. I wouldn't send so I sent my sons to a all-boys Catholic lay school because I wouldn't send them to a school the diocese ran for theological reasons. So there's a problem there too, which is you got to figure out what it is that you're saving and what's that going to look like. If you figured out all this stuff out, well, there's a second battle within the church for this. What are we actually trying to teach?
Tom and I had this conversation several years ago when the Catholic Education Foundation was formed. Its initial sole purpose was giving out scholarships to kids in Catholic high schools. And when I came on board, I said, I think it's a wonderful thing to do, but I want to make sure that the schools are Catholic. And that's how we got involved with the Catholic identity assessment, and then into this next phase with formation of priests in this regard. And Dennis mentioned about, just in passing, the 501c3 regulation about what you can and cannot do from the pulpit. And this is very interesting because he correctly quotes the IRS code that says it can't be a substantial amount of your outreach for political purposes. And whatever the figure is that they play with, well, first point is no one has ever lost his tax-exempt status for doing anything, all right? And certainly black ministers in the Bronx all the time bring the candidates into their pulpits and tell the people that's how they have to vote. At any rate, when we talk about substantial, if you're talking about the usual parish that we have, and one with a school and so forth, so you have 6, 7 weekend masses, you have a school, you have a food pantry, a soup kitchen, an adult education program, a widowers group, and all the rest of these things. Add up all of the hours, all right? So probably 500, 600 hours of activity every week by your parish. And if twice a year you explicitly endorse someone or a program from your pulpit, which takes up 2 hours perhaps, this is infinitesimal. It could never, ever be challenged even. But we've been conditioned, unfortunately, by the Bishops' Conference of the United States, right, to back off all of this stuff. And there was a memo back in the 80s from the Bishops' Conference telling dioceses, don't get involved in any kind of political activity because we don't want to lose our precious tax-exempt status. But the truth of the matter is, it never goes anywhere. There was a priest who was the editor of the Catholic paper in one of the South Texas dioceses, and he had come out very strongly against a pro-abortion politician in an editorial in his paper. And the diocese was threatened with removal of its tax-exempt status. And that priest, very gutsy, put his editorial on the front page of the paper the next week and said, IRS, down. no one ever touched it. No one ever touched it.
And the other thing is there's a distinction between advocacy and electoral politics also. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the Catholic, and there's no legal question that the Catholic Church is allowed to advance its teachings on a whole array of issues, including education.
And by the way, this is the point in terms of preaching, that when we're talking about this in a Catholic context, and Tom alluded to this, this is part of Catholic teaching that parents are the primary educators of their children and that they have a right to choose the most appropriate educational environment for their children without financial penalty. That's Catholic teaching. It's in the Catechism, it's in the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. So you are on completely terra firma to promote that from the pulpit and to say that people have an obligation to vote according to that norm of the Church. And we talk about economic hostages. There was a very amusing situation that occurred in Toms River, where I graduated from high school, St. Joseph's. About 15 years ago, it became known that the administrators of every public school in Toms River, whether or not Catholic, had their children in St. Joseph's Grammar School and St. Joseph's High School, right? Which first of all tells you about what they think about their own school system, all right? And the Toms River School District got so agitated by it that it made a policy that if you work for the Toms River School District, you must send your children to the public schools of Toms River. Well, we made great hay out of this. We said, it's not bad enough that we keep economic hostages in the inner city, so blacks and Hispanics and so forth who have no choice because they have no money. But now even people who can afford to pay for it are told they can't make the choice. And if that's how bad your school is, that you have to keep hostages at all these levels, then the whole system ought to collapse anyway. And of course, needless to say, it was unconstitutional, and the norm lasted for probably about 2 weeks, but they had egg on their face as a result of it.
One of the handouts I left there is a publication of the Catholic Conference of Bishops that clearly says what clergy can and cannot do in the political arena. And if you want to read it from another author, the Pew Forum, you've heard the Pew Charitable Trust, has on the internet Politics and the Pulpit. It says 2008, but the law hasn't changed, so this is still okay. You can look that up on the internet. And this is very detailed. I think they have examples. A pastor did this, and somebody said that, and and how the cases were resolved. But basically, it's simple. You can't advocate for, endorse a party or a candidate or an incumbent, but you can do whatever you want so far as issues are concerned.
So, questions, comments? There are several Pennsylvanians here. How is your tax credit thing operating in Pennsylvania now?
Well, obviously, we have a governor who is opposed to.
But you have that mechanism.
ITC.
Yeah.
It's not something that really is widespread. We've gotten some help from it, but I don't really get the feeling that it's made a huge difference.
To some extent.
Anybody else with school choice initiatives in any places where you are?
We have the tax credit. We have a very liberal voucher system in Indiana, which is relatively new. We also have the tax credits.
Right.
Whereas the state tax credit, whereas say I give $1,000 to send to the school, I get a $500 tax credit on my Indiana state tax. And if I'm in a certain bracket, which I'm not, on the federal level, I even get more. So I can give $1,000 to St. Luke and it costs me $500. You were saying, Tom, about the administration of it. I mean, it's administered through what we call an SGO, Scholarship Granting Organization. The Archdiocese could set up their own, but we don't, because there's a place called, there's a business person in Indiana that set this sort of thing up years ago, but there was no tax credit. It was just a way to fund private schools. But now with the tax, it's called the Institute for Quality Education. They administer it for us. And if somebody gives $1,000 to St. Luke's, it gets it through them.
Right.
We pay them a small fee to administer it, and it's worth it. I mean, it'd just be one more thing for us to do the administration of it. So as far as who the SGO is, we don't know here. Now, some dioceses, I think, have set up their own. In Indiana, at least in northern Indiana, there's a substantial number of Lutheran schools. And then you have a few evangelical schools. But the school must be accredited by the state. You can't have a Baptist school that's in the minister's garage getting vouchers for this, what I'm describing, the tax credit.
Right.
Anybody else? But, you know, I hope you see, this is a social justice issue, all right? And we're fond of talking. John the 23rd is often quoted about, the importance of representing the poor and the oppressed. And but in his Hospice Mentality, he said, "Let no man claim the rights for others who has not first claimed the rights for himself." And so it really does matter. I mean, if we can't represent our own people and to teach them how to represent their interests and the good of our children and the future of the church in this country, then we've abandoned the ship at a very, very serious level. And we've been doing that for 100 years, actually. That's the problem. All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. And let's look at Mass at 10 after 5 in the seminary chapel. And so when you come up the stairs, before you go into the chapel, come to the sacristy, and we have vestments for everybody. And I think probably the simplest thing to do is, after you're vested in your alb and chasuble, simply go take a place in the front pews, and just the bishop and I and Paul will process in. It'll be easier, and come up into the sanctuary at the preface. And then after reception of Holy Communion, go back to the pews.